am a Black Welsh writer, artist, and curator. So I see curating as something that can be broken down into three things. The first being a more traditional perception of curating, which is collecting, and an exhibition you could describe or define as just a collection of artworks. And therefore, curating starts with the process of deciding what that collection is, and basically um, deciding an overarching theme or question or a type of art that you want to present, and then selecting artworks that fit into that. Another definition of curating is caring, and that's linked to the root word for curation in Latin, I think. And fundamentally, you could describe curator as a caretaker, both of artists and artworks, but also of the exhibition development process and the audience. So basically, every step of the way, it's the curator's job to care for the process and the people involved with it, to make sure that you are both making sure that it's like an enriching cultural experience for everybody involved, but also that you are meeting what you set out to do from the beginning. So, what that theme is, for example. And finally, I define a curator as a communicator. And I think curators mediate between artist and audience, and is equally invested in both groups' experience of the exhibition. And as artists, like I can speak for myself, and I'm sure all of you, that we want our artwork to be well received by audiences. And what audiences often need is a bit of a helping hand to fully engage with the artwork. So curators go about developing the context of the exhibition, which is how the artworks are presented, but also if there's any text that goes along with that. The curator is responsible for writing that. While those are the things the curator does, the curating process is a very individual thing. You get to curate in whatever way that you want to, whatever way feels right. And some curators have a pretty like set out system that they apply to every exhibition that they curate, and other curators like to take a slightly more personalized approach and think of an exhibition and what it needs to be, and then develop the process that they want to apply to that alongside the exhibition. I wanted to open it up to a group discussion, and ask you all what your thoughts are on what black art is, and and then the follow-up question of why does it need to be curated differently, of course.
I think for myself, because I'm a musician, black art for me has always been about telling our story and speaking about our struggle and representing it in a really beautiful way.
What is not black art then? What would you define as something that maybe is or isn't created by black artists, but you wouldn't say, or the first thing you would describe that artwork as not black art? What are the visual representations of black art like?
I think I'd say black art is also very vibrant, even though it's called black art. I think it juxtaposes its own name by being very vibrant and powerful and in your face, and very. I think it usually is represented in a very strong way. That is, I suppose, more of a movement than an art.
So somebody said something kind of interesting to me about black art. He was an American, right, who I follow on Instagram, right, and he's a photographer, and he said something about black art is that irrespective of wherever the black diaspora is, right, there's certain things that they can connect to, irrespective. It's a universal kind of language kind of thing, right, and I think that's what black art is. It's irrespective. You could be in New Zealand, you can be in Cardiff, right? There's certain things that you'll just identify to, be it music, be it film, be it, and whatever the medium, irrespective of what the medium is.
Yeah.
And that's what black art is. It's just a unique point of view.
Does anyone in the group who identifies as black not identify their art as Black art?
I think that that's a bit of a tough question to answer for myself because, like I said, I do music, so I feel like as a young black man in the UK, my music would always be classed as black art, if that makes sense. Like I've sort of been put in a position where I would never be able to come out of this sort of thing in that everything that I create sonically as a music project will always be classed as black art because I myself am black. Um, I think it becomes a little bit more of a gray area if you don't perhaps make stereotypically the art that is associated to the culture. And I think then it becomes a bit different again, but then people will always see you as a black artist first than they would your genre first, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. But I do think it's interesting that I asked the question, do you define your own art as Black art? And your answer is, well, other people define it for me. And it's true, there are certain things as an artist that you can and can't control, and you can't control how other people label your art.
I mean, personally, myself, I don't know because when I do R&B, I feel like it's not black art, but I say that because R&B is a genre that has now, I suppose, dipped into so many different cultures, and so many cultures have put their own struggle and their own imprint on it. That the way we view what R&B is today has changed a lot. But then on the other side of it, when I do hip hop or grime music or stuff like that, that has always been something prevalent in the black community and in black culture. So when I do hip hop and grime, yes, I 100% feel like I'm doing black art because it's a craft that we've honed for decades. But yeah, when I do R&B or pop or something like that, it's a bit different because so many other cultures have put their own, I suppose, input into it.
Like for myself, with my music, I see it as, I don't really see it as black art or like black music. Even with my like performance art, I just see it as performance art. And then the subjects I deal with may resonate more with people that look like me, or some of the way I fuse the music, some of it doesn't make sense to people who look like me. Like, okay, this sounds like this, but you're speaking this language, it doesn't make sense to some people. And I've had that before. But I feel like art is like you define it for yourself. I feel like my music is like chamber music. It's a genre on its own. So my performance art is also my imprint. I feel like every artist have their own unique language that it's very difficult when you start to group it. Like I've had an experience with a radio presenter from BBC email me back talking about a song, telling me about how she would prefer a genre, like a sound that is more electronic for me. And I never understood that, you know. I was like, what is she actually saying, you know? So I have had people tell me stuff and I'm just like, that's actually not their decision.
There are so many different definitions of black art, but that's the same really with any art. But I do think there's a specific thing that comes up when you talk about black art, and that is how identity relates to self-expression, but also how the art is received. Um, like art more generally is about self-expression, so I think it's natural for people when they're talking about how they relate to artworks and an artist's work to bring up, oh well, this is what I receive from it from a personal point of view, and understand that it's subjective what people take away from it, and that subjectivity is informed by like our lives, how we've lived, how we've experienced the world, and what we are and aren't able to see and like receive from art. It's made more complicated when you talk about black art because you're talking about how an identity which is at its roots something that is politicized, that is marginalized, that is linked to experiences of oppression, how that is taken on into the art, and what I early on when I used to think about kind of black art and how it was received by predominantly white audiences, the thing that I really didn't like or like I struggled to grapple with was how it would be placed. It would kind of be, I guess, ghettoized as, oh, the black art's over here, and they're only able to talk about black things, which are inherently non-universal, which is a way of dehumanizing black people, because why is the black experience not universal, but the white experience is? Like, that's all of that is kind of wrapped up into it. But I think personally for me, I've kind of come through that journey, and where I'm at with it now is an understanding that actually I don't have an issue with my art being perceived as black art. What I do have an issue with is art made by white people that is very clearly about the white experience and isn't universal, having that art being framed as just art, as universal, as normal, and everything else is other to that. So I wanted to share also, kind of on the theme of black art more generally, I wanted to share a couple different black art movements in the past, obviously centered around the Harlem neighborhood in New York City, and the African American communities who lived in that neighborhood. And it was just a moment of flourishing of a bunch of different black artists who were writers, who were painters, who were musicians, who were photographers, and playwrights, any medium that you can think of. So there wasn't a single style that defined this art movement, but what it was defined by was all of these artists use their art to celebrate their African American culture and identity, and they were kind of focused on that experience in that moment of time. So they were tackling contemporary themes, and it was in response to and in aiming to counteract the derogatory kind of caricatures that were being presented of them and their experience in the time in the mainstream culture. And I mean, you can see that with the painting on the left. It's an everyday scene of a schoolyard, of black students and black teachers, and it's just like the liveliness of that. And then the photograph on the right is a couple in some fur coats. They wanted to show their experience as one that wasn't bound by struggle, and it was everyday, it was mundane in some terms, and in other terms it was very like affluent, and there were people who were coming up and who weren't defined by their struggle. So that's what tied these group of black artists together. Another black art movement was called the Black Arts Movement, and this was again in America in the 60s, however. So obviously around the time of the civil rights era, and this art movement took on a more overtly political kind of stance. It was kind of around the civil rights movement. There were a lot of activists coming up from everyday black communities across America, and they were paying attention to how political uses of art could draw in their communities and get them to become radicalized essentially, and join in with the struggle, with the movement to gain civil rights. And there was this whole thing around creating a new black aesthetic, and this was one kind of black theorist spoke about this black aesthetic as being the aesthetic and spiritual sister of the black power concept. So they saw it as like the same, like a part of the same struggle as what the activists were doing, which was quite directly like identifying how their communities were being oppressed and working against that. And then there was this visual aesthetic movement alongside that, which was equally important to get people to acknowledge, black people, and more specifically to acknowledge the strength of their communities, that they were, to show them that they were allowed to dream, So it was slightly different to the Harlem Renaissance, which was kind of projecting outwards. And obviously it was, the Harlem Renaissance also was for Black communities, but this was quite specifically kind of projecting outwards. This is what Blackness is. It's not all of the things that you've said it is. This is what it can be. And this is, and therefore, like, it was aspirational in that way. It was striving to be more. And then we've got the Black British art movement, which happened in Britain in the 1980s. And this was, again, quite radical political art movement that happened in the 1980s. And it was inspired by anti-racist and feminist discourse that was happening around the time. And particularly, it was kind of led by a new generation of Black diaspora in Britain who were kind of second generation, so the kids of the Windrush generation and more, and generations that kind of came from different parts of the empire to Britain, entering art school. So these were all kind of people who were Black identifying, who were going to like starting off their careers wanting to be artists quite specifically. One thing that's quite interesting about this movement is that it wasn't limited to the African diaspora. So at the time in the 80s in Britain, the concept of political Blackness was a big thing. And what that was kind of the Asians and Arabs and people of Asian and Arab descent kind of taking on the identity of Black in a political way to stand in solidarity with African Black people. And this was kind of in response to the very kind of stratified approach to race that Britain took in colonization in the empire, which did position Asians and Arabs above African people. And so they were, and that was a very specific tactic taken to quash any sense of solidarity between these communities who were all being oppressed in different ways by colonization. So they were, in response, they all took on the label of Black. So now I just wanted to go on and share my personal approach to curating Black art and art more widely, and kind of share that hopefully to help you get thinking about how you could approach curating your own Black art, your own art more generally as well. So for me, I think the approach that I take to curating is a very personal one. And I always start with myself in terms of why do I want to curate an exhibition or an event or whatever around this certain theme, and being very clear on my intentions. I think intentions are a good way to kind of to have that drawn at the beginning, be very clear, and then kind of throughout the process checking back in with your intentions and seeing and helping use that to guide you in your process. I also find it really helpful to carve out time when you're researching, like in that research phase of an exhibition, to be in conversation and in community with others, both to better understand my own approach or perspective on the story of the exhibition, in me sharing with multiple different people what my thoughts and feelings are around these themes, etc. But also to understand as many other different perspectives on this same story that I can. I think with an exhibition that you want people to come and see, that you need to acknowledge that there's such a diversity in experience that people will be bringing with them when they come to your exhibition, and the better that you can understand the different kinds of people that will be coming to see your art, the better position that you are in to develop an exhibition with all of that in mind, so that you are putting in the context, the text that you need to help bring people along regardless of where they're coming from. I also, and this is a big one, is acknowledging that just because I'm Black, I'm not an expert on all that is Black art, and letting this guide my approach in so much as, again, checking in with as many different kinds of this, in this case, more specifically Black people, to see what am I taking for granted in when I'm talking about these themes, that I might think are a universal Black experience, but then in having a conversation with another Black person from another a diaspora, class, gender, whatever, realize actually it's not that universal. It's something that needs more explaining. And that's a good way to kind of identify what your blind spots are when you're telling the story, and fill in those, as many of those gaps as possible. For me, one thing that I do quite consciously also is decenter whiteness. And what I mean by that is, in so much as like we've already touched on the thing of like art without that prefix of Black art being something that is normalized and something that only white people and white artists seem to have access to a lot of the time. I feel like there is a bit of that internalized in all of us, and how we envision an arts audience as well, as being perhaps predominantly white. And that's something that I like to challenge in my work, when I'm doing things that are very specifically about Blackness. I could care less how a white person receives it. What I'm more interested in is how Black communities, how my communities are going to come and receive it. So that's what I mean by decentering whiteness. I mean not prioritizing the white experience, because that is what is sold to us as the normal experience. Another thing that I like to do is build plot through the pairings of different artworks together, and how I organize the artworks more generally. I like to approach an exhibition in this kind of a similar way that I do my writing, in that there's a plot, there's a starting point, and there is an end point, and then there is a journey from one to the other. And it's not necessarily a linear, straightforward journey. There's sub themes that you want to touch on. There's like flourishes of like things that you just there because they're beautiful, and they give people the feelings that you want them to feel when alongside the artworks, and all of that I think is important. Obviously the artwork should be the main focus, but I think it's without providing those other things, you lose an opportunity to prime people to feel what you want them to feel about your art. And then finally, I lean on my skills as a poet in my exhibition text writing. I find kind of standard exhibition text to be very boring. It's one thing that turns me off, but actually whenever I go into an exhibition, it's the first thing that I do is go and look at what is written about the artwork before I take it fully in, because I don't claim to know everything about art, and I want to get all of the references that the artist is touching on. I want to give myself the best opportunity or the best chance to really like feel something from this work of art. So I find it helpful to have a text there that is engaging, to help prime you before I engage with the art. Like, how do you think being an artist can help prime you to take on your curator role and whatever art that you create? How is that artistic process that you take in creating your own art? How can you like draw from that in creating a process of how you curate work as well?
I think the main thing is thinking about how you want your information or whatever message or just your art in general to be received by people, making sure that it's accurately represented, and also that there aren't any like forms of bias. And the reason I say that is because I think sometimes if someone else were to display our art or we were to display someone else's art, we would display it in a way that makes sense to us. But as you said, that might not necessarily be the norm, or that might not necessarily be how the artist wanted it to be kind of perceived. So I think it's important to stay true to what the artist wants. And then obviously if it is then received in another way, then obviously that's a different conversation and that's fine. But as long as it is true to what started, I think that's the best way to go.
I think sometimes when you make art, there's that sense of emerging, something putting itself forward or something simply happening. And maybe that process can happen within curation as well, where sometimes by just allowing things to come together, stories emerge and put themselves forward. And it's almost like they were always there, but they weren't seen before.
What about people's specific mediums? Like, I'm not sure, like I know some of you musicians, photographers, etc., filmmakers. What in that media, how do you approach creating art specifically in that medium, and how can you pull that into organizing an exhibition?
I approach the different mediums I have just all with honesty as the first thing to go for, and I actually wanted to like raise a point from like before the whole like black art thing. There's a quote I think from Langston Hughes, and he had an essay he wrote, I think it's like The Racial Mountain, like or something, but he essentially talks about how certain black artists stray away from the title of being called a black artist, because sometimes they kind of want to aspire towards whiteness by saying, oh, I'm not a black artist, I'm like an artist, because that's more universal. So I think ever since like that quote, it's really stuck with me. Even though it's not like a black and white thing, it's not like so clear cut. But I think really creating with the intent to express yourself first before how it's going to be perceived and defined, because obviously you have no control over that. Some people, even if your intention is to represent the black community, some people are still gonna feel offended by it. Some people are gonna think your work is racist. Some people are gonna think, I don't know, whatever. As long as you're thinking about the people that you want to target and the artist's intention and the genuine love for the artists that you're trying to cover and their work, then I think that's probably the best approach to make.
I think for me as a musician, in terms of like putting together my work and how it's received and the kind of audience that I'd be expecting, I don't know if any other musicians in here feel the same, but I've always had this sense of my music and what I make isn't made for people. It's more like made with the intention of telling my story and expressing my life and the way I think and the way I am as a person. When I release music, I don't really have the sense of, I wonder how it's going to be received, or I wonder whether people are going to relate to something I felt. Being Black and then being a Black artist and musician as well sort of nurtures you into this like way of understanding that your experience isn't the same as somebody else's experience. So even if my music is something that you can relate to loosely, it's still loosely, if that makes sense. Like, it's not an exact tale of your life or an exact tale of your experience. So I suppose my audience has never been something that mattered, because I always wanted to be unapologetically me. All of that history that has come with being Black plays a massive part into who I am today, and definitely who I'm going to be tomorrow. And I don't ever want to feel like I've got to adjust what I've curated or what I've made or what I've put together to pander to, I suppose, this belief that I've got to be somebody else just to be approved or just to be improved.
I think that's a great place to start. That's a really solid foundation, and that'll guide you really well in whatever you come across when you're curating, because there is a bit of a juggling act that you have to do where you like balance what you want artistically, what you want to communicate artistically. But also, exhibitions come with a bunch of like practical, boring, logistical considerations of how things are physically able to exist. Um, and there is a kind of a give and take there, but I think it's important to be really solid on what you want to communicate artistically. There isn't one single black experience. There's as many black experiences as there are black people, and there are very specific communities and cultures within that. And this whole, I mean, we didn't come up with this concept of blackness. We didn't come up with this and this thing that is tying us together. Kind of, yes, there are universal black experiences, but there are also black experiences that are specific to certain diasporas, certain to black women, to black queer people, like all of these different kinds of black people. And they're not any less or more black. There's just more than one black experience, and I think in curating black art, that's one thing that you're going to come up against quite a lot, is people trying to put it all into one neat box and be like, this is what it is. And my advice would be fight against that as much as you can, because it doesn't make sense. It's not realistic to say that however many black people in the world will get to a point where we agree on what blackness is and what white people need to know about blackness. And even that, like, why do white people need to know anything about blackness? Like, if they don't have any agency over the black experience, then why do they need to understand it? Like, other than, like, if they're able to, sure, great, but like, I don't think that should be the focus of what we do when we're making black art and when we're sharing black art.